November 19th, 1985. Dawson County, Montana. After leaving on a road trip from Oregon to travel back to his home in Wisconsin, 67-year-old Dexter Stefonek disappears and his burning car is discovered at an isolated rest area. Only a half hour earlier, a witness had seen an unidentified man driving Dexter's car into the rest area while carrying 2 containers of gasoline. 3.5 months later, Dexter's body is discovered at a remote dump site. He has been beaten and shot twice in the head, but the identity of his killer and the motive for his murder remain unknown. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we are covering yet another highly requested case which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the 1985 murder of Dexter Stefonek. Unsolved Mysteries was a show which could cause you to develop a lifelong fear of a number of things, and right at the top of my list of fears would be rest stops. Some of the most frightening cases ever featured on the show involved people being victimized at remote, isolated rest stops in the middle of nowhere. In this particular case, we have the brutal unsolved murder of an elderly man who was abducted from a rest stop in rural Montana on a brutally cold day before his car was set on fire, and as if this story couldn't be more on the nose, this location was actually named the Bad Route Rest Area. Seriously, who actually thought that name was a good idea? Overall, this definitely ranks as one of the more baffling cases on Unsolved Mysteries because the crime seemed completely senseless, and there are a number of things about the killer's actions which defy explanation. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, so if you would like to support the show, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold, and for as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards from our podcast, which may include stickers and thank you cards from yours truly, early access to episodes, and bonus content. I will be providing thank yous and shoutouts to our most recent patrons near the end of this episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unsolved murder of Dexter Stefonek. Our story begins in 1985, and our central figure is 67-year-old Dexter Stefonek, a retired paper mill worker from the town of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Dexter is nearly 1 year removed from the passing of his wife Vivian, whom he was married to for 44 years. Tragically, Vivian had actually passed away on Christmas Day in 1984, while the couple was visiting their son David and their grandchildren at their farm in Corbett, Oregon. By the time November 1985 rolled around, Dexter had been staying at his son's farm for a few months, and David thought his father might spend the entire winter there. However, as the 1 year anniversary of Vivian's death approached, Dexter told David that he wanted to return to Rhinelander. So on the morning of November 18th, Dexter said goodbye to his family and climbed into his Plymouth Horizon to begin the 2,000-mile drive home. Dexter told David that he wanted to complete the trip as quickly as possible, so instead of spending the night at motels, he would just pull over at rest stops if he needed to sleep. At around 10 a.m. on the morning of November 19th, the local police and fire department were summoned to a rest stop in Dawson County, Montana, called the Bad Route Rest Area, which was located in an isolated area off Interstate 94, 17 miles west of the small town of Glendive. Clyde Mitchell, a maintenance supervisor for the Montana Department of Highways, had driven past the rest stop and noticed a burning car in the parking lot so he contacted the authorities. When help arrived and the fire was put out, the torched vehicle was identified as a Plymouth Horizon, and a computer check revealed that it belonged to Dexter Stefonek. However, Dexter himself was nowhere to be found. Glendive was located nearly 1,100 miles from Corbett, so the rest area was just over the halfway point on Dexter's lengthy drive back home to Rhinelander. The last time he was confirmed to be alive was when he stopped for gas in Park City, nearly 250 miles away. Since it was a very cold, snowy morning with a high wind chill, it was feared that perhaps Dexter had wandered off to seek help and succumbed to exposure, but a search of the surrounding countryside turned up no trace of him. After the Plymouth Horizon was examined, it was determined that it had been doused with gasoline and that the fire was a clear-cut case of arson. The majority of the accelerant had been poured over the back seat, giving off the impression that this was an attempt to destroy potential evidence. The driver's seat was also pushed back very far, and since Dexter was a short man, this suggested that a taller person had been driving the vehicle before it was set on fire. But even though Dexter could not be found, there were two eyewitnesses who were able to provide some compelling leads. Clyde Mitchell, the aforementioned maintenance supervisor who discovered the burning car, and Fred Siegley, the custodian of the Bad Route rest area. Siegley arrived at the rest stop nearly 2 hours before Dexter's car was found, but the only vehicle in the parking lot at that time was a white Chevy 4x4 pickup truck. Clyde Mitchell arrived 15 minutes later and also saw the truck, but there didn't seem to be any sign of the driver. Both men described the truck as having a wide blue horizontal stripe, a white camper shell top, and a cattle guard on the front bumper. Before Mitchell left the rest area, he noticed that the pickup had Arizona license plates, and there was also apparently some bedding and clothes in the back to suggest someone had been living in the vehicle. But the biggest lead occurred when Siegley was leaving the rest area at around 9:30 a.m. and saw Dexter's Plymouth Horizon pull into the parking lot. Siegley claimed that an unidentified man wearing a parka climbed out of the vehicle and he was carrying 2 large plastic containers. Siegley called out to the man and asked if he needed assistance. The man said he had run out of gas, but everything was okay because he had just gone to go get some. Siegley then left, but within a half hour, the Plymouth Horizon would be discovered in flames, and the pickup truck was gone. While Siegley described the man as being around 6 feet tall and between 35 and 40 years old, he was a great distance away when he saw him, and did not get a good enough look to provide enough details for a composite sketch. Siegley and Mitchell would both later be placed under hypnosis in hopes that they would remember more details about what they saw, but the only information they could recall were the first 3 digits of the license plate, 147. A search of Arizona DMV records turned up 279 pickup trucks which had those 3 digits start off their license number, and while investigators narrowed down the number of potential matches to 60, they were unable to uncover any promising suspects. The case left everyone completely baffled, and it would be nearly 4 months before there were any answers about what happened to Dexter. On March 8, 1986, a local couple named Bill and Cindy Shaw took a trip to a remote landfill in order to dump some garbage. The location was a private dump site used by only about 5 families on land which was owned by a local rancher. The spot was 17 miles from the Bad Route rest area, 2 miles from the main highway, and 150 feet away from a rural dirt road. The Shaws were surprised to find a wallet on the ground containing Dexter Stefonek's driver's license, and since his disappearance was still a big news story in the area, the couple decided to perform a thorough search of the dump site. It wasn't long before they discovered a man's foot sticking out from beneath a discarded mattress. A body was concealed underneath there, and even though the cold winter weather had preserved it, the victim's face and hands had been gnawed away by animals. Once the police were notified, dental records were used to conclusively identify him as Dexter Stefonek. He had been beaten over the head with a blunt object, likely a gun, before he was shot twice in the back of the head. According to the coroner, the condition of Dexter's body seemed to indicate that it had been there since he originally went missing in November. However, there were a number of perplexing questions. Dexter's suitcase, along with much of his clothing, was also found scattered around the dump site. The Shaws often went there to dump garbage, and had last been at the site a week before the body was discovered, but claimed they did not remember seeing Dexter's wallet, suitcase, or clothing during the preceding months. Furthermore, since the clothing was still in relatively good condition, it seemed unlikely that it could have been lying outside in the winter weather since November. Another strange detail is that there was still money inside Dexter's wallet and suitcase, so robbery did not seem like the motive for his murder. Over a week after the discovery of Dexter's body, police decided to perform another search of the Bad Route Rest area and discovered a strange piece of graffiti scrawled in pencil on the grout line of a wall inside the men's room. It read, quote, "Hot Jock shot wad from Wisconsin, 11-85, Saturday the 3rd." End quote. Well, even though Dexter was not killed on the 3rd, the fact that he was from Wisconsin and shot in November of 1985 made them suspect the graffiti might have been left by the killer. The case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in April of 1989, but failed to generate any significant leads at finding the killer, so after 30 years, there are still no answers about who was actually responsible for the murder of Dexter Stefonek. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, this is one of those cases where you only need to utter a few phrases to an Unsolved Mysteries fan, such as Bad Route Rest Area or Hot Jock, and they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Like I mentioned earlier, the show featured a number of horrific crimes which took place in isolated rest stops. As you recall, one of these cases, the Blind River Rest Stop murders, was featured on this very podcast. But Dexter Stefonek's murder is definitely the most baffling out of all of them. In the Blind River Rest Stop murders, the perpetrator robbed the victims before he killed them, so he did seem to have a motive, but in Dexter's case, someone inexplicably decided to brutally murder a harmless elderly man and did not even bother to take his money. Even if the motive to murder Dexter was nothing more than a simple thrill kill, it still seems like the killer went through a lot of complicated steps to cover his tracks, and some of his actions just don't make much logical sense. Well, believe it or not, police did investigate one potential suspect, and this part of the story was never mentioned in the Unsolved Mysteries segment. After Dexter's wife, Vivian, passed away, he became very close with another woman who lived in Rhinelander named Amy Hine, who was recently divorced and had 5 children. While the entire family seemed to adore Dexter, the big issue was that Amy was only 34 years old, nearly half Dexter's age, so when he asked Amy if she would marry him, she said no. On November 18th, right before he left his son's farm in Corbett, Dexter mailed Amy a letter which read, "I miss you and the children and the family worship. May the Lord be with you until we meet again. Love, Dexter." After Dexter left Corbett, he actually made a side trip to Washington State to meet a man named Arnold Gracious, who happened to be Amy's father. Dexter and Arnold had invested in some cars together and were arranging the transport of these vehicles to Wisconsin before Dexter headed east and continued his drive home. Given that Dexter was trying to woo his much younger daughter, investigators briefly explored the idea that Arnold might have disapproved so strongly that he had a motive to murder Dexter, but Arnold was quickly ruled out as a suspect. While this part of the story has no real connection to the crime, it sheds some light on Dexter's rather odd decision to leave his son's home and make such a lengthy drive back to Rhinelander. The Unsolved Mystery segment gives off the impression that Dexter needed to be back home with the 1-year anniversary of his wife's death approaching, which is understandable since she had passed away in Corbett on Christmas Day. But the fact that Dexter mailed a letter to Amy on the very same morning he started his drive seems to indicate that she was the reason he needed to return home so quickly. He may have been planning to make another attempt to propose to Amy, and this would also explain his decision to pull over at rest stops to sleep rather than spend the night at motels. Amy would later express regret over having turned down Dexter's proposal, as she probably felt he never would have been compelled to drive home so quickly and pull over at the Bad Route Rest Area if she had said yes. That's a terrible burden to live with, and just another tragic element of this story. But overall, it seems pretty obvious that Dexter was not specifically targeted, given that he was in the middle of nowhere near the halfway point of a 2,000-mile road trip, so it's really doubtful that anyone would be able to track him down to that remote location. The most likely explanation is that Dexter simply wound up in the wrong place at the wrong time and crossed paths with a stranger who murdered him. Given that Dexter was planning to pull over at rest stops when he needed a nap, it's possible he was sleeping inside his car at the Bad Route rest area when he was attacked by his killer. Now, the police have their own theory about the perpetrator already being at the rest area before Dexter arrived, but we'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to address one of the most infamous aspects of this case, the graffiti which was discovered on the men's room wall. At the time the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired, they would not reveal the full contents of the graffiti, only that it contained the phrase "hot jock" and mentioned someone being shot. The police seemed pretty convinced that it was written by the killer, and theorized that hot jock may have been the CB handle for a truck driver. So I always assumed that there was some incriminating information in there which was intentionally withheld. Well, it wasn't until a 30th anniversary article was published about the case in 2015 when the full message was finally revealed publicly, and it read, "Hot jock shot wad from Wisconsin, 11-85, Saturday the 3rd. And, well, assuming that nothing was left out here, this causes me to look at the graffiti in an entirely different light. All I'll say is that if you perform a Google search on the phrase hot jock, all of your top matches are going to be related to gay porn. So yeah, once I see the exact words are hot jock shot wad, I'm no longer inclined to think that this message is connected to an unsolved murder. I mean, I can see why investigators would find it compelling, given that it mentioned Dexter's home state, Wisconsin, and the exact month and year when Dexter was killed, but the Saturday the 3rd part doesn't even make any sense, since the murder took place on the 19th, and November the 3rd did not even take place on a Saturday that year. It would not surprise me if this message was a reference to a secret gay rendezvous which occurred in that bathroom, and it's just a coincidence that someone from Wisconsin just happened to be abducted and murdered from the rest area that same month. Dexter Stefonek does not strike me as the type of man who would be having secret gay hookups inside a rest stop bathroom, and there's no indication that this murder was sexually motivated at all. There's also the fact that the graffiti was written in pencil in the wall's grout line, so if the killer wanted to flaunt his crime, he didn't exactly write his message out in the open. I would not be surprised if that message was written before the crime even took place, and the police just didn't notice it before. So unless I'm completely missing something, I'm inclined to think that the graffiti has no relation to this case at all. But what was the actual motive for Dexter's murder? Well, obviously, since money was left behind in Dexter's wallet and suitcase, the motive definitely wasn't robbery. During the Unsolved Mysteries segment, the local sheriff provided a theory which does make some sense. He suspected that the unidentified driver of the Chevy pickup truck may have run out of gas and gotten stranded at the Bad Route rest area. He waited there a long time for someone to come along, and when Dexter pulled into the rest area, the driver may have asked him for help. But Dexter chose to either reject or ignore him, perhaps unintentionally because he was hard of hearing. This reaction wound up setting the driver off, so he forcibly hijacked Dexter's Plymouth Horizon, either driving or forcing Dexter to drive the vehicle to another location. At some point, Dexter was beaten and shot to death before his body was concealed underneath the mattress at the remote dump site 17 miles away. The killer then drove Dexter's car to get gas somewhere and then returned to the rest area. Since Fred Siegley saw the man carrying multiple containers, the implication seems to be that he needed gas both to fill up his own vehicle and torch Dexter's car to destroy potential evidence. Well, it seems pretty extreme to brutally murder an elderly man over gasoline. Think about the circumstances. If the killer did run out of gas, for all we know, he may have spent all night hanging around the rest area in freezing winter weather with a high wind chill. If he was already a mentally unhinged person to begin with, then he could have been seriously on edge by the time Dexter arrived. If Dexter chose to ignore him or refuse to help, this may have been the breaking point which set him off to commit murder. This is a very plausible theory, but there are still some things about it which don't make much sense. One of the big questions about this case which has never been satisfactorily answered is, where did the killer get the gasoline? I mean, this was a very remote, isolated area, and there wasn't exactly a gas station at every corner. I'd assume there would only be a limited amount of places in the area to purchase fuel, and I have to think police checked all gas stations within a reasonable distance to see if anyone remembered a man in a parka driving Dexter's Plymouth Horizon into their station to fill 2 containers with gasoline. I mean, this was rural Montana in 1985, long before the days of pay at the pump. If anyone wanted to fill up 2 containers with fuel, they would have to interact with an employee. And we're talking a window of only about a couple of hours here, so it's surprising to me that no one seemed to remember anyone matching the killer's description purchasing gasoline that morning. This is another reason why it's surprising that the perpetrator left Dexter's money behind in his wallet and suitcase. Buying an extra can of gas in order to cover up this crime was going to cost money, so why not at least take the cash the victim had on him and use it? Another weird aspect of this case which doesn't make much sense to me is the discovery of Dexter's wallet, suitcase, and clothing scattered around the dump site right before the body was found. If you believe Bill and Cindy Shaw, they were at that place multiple times during the months Dexter was missing, but they did not see those items there. And due to the condition of the clothing, investigators did not believe it could have been outside in that winter weather those entire 3.5 months. I don't doubt Dexter's body was there during that whole time period, but it's interesting how when he was found, his foot was sticking out from beneath the mattress. I know that other people besides the Shaws used that dump site, so it is kind of surprising to me that it took that long for anyone to notice the foot. So on the surface, the implication seems to be that after leaving Dexter's body in the landfill, the killer returned to the location months later and made it easier for him to be discovered. Perhaps they pulled Dexter's foot out from beneath the mattress and then scattered his personal items around to garner someone's attention. If this person was anxious for his crime to garner some attention, they might have grown frustrated that no one was finding Dexter and decided to speed up the process. But on the other hand, if the perpetrator was yearning for attention, then that kind of contradicts the police's original theory that the murder was an unplanned rage killing. Now, even if Dexter's clothing wasn't scattered out in the open for 3.5 months, that doesn't necessarily mean the killer had it in his possession the entire time. It's possible he dumped Dexter's suitcase with the clothing still inside, but decided to open it and scatter the clothing around days before the body was discovered. Or a more innocent explanation is that it might not have been the actual killer who did this. An alternate theory is that a random scavenger visited the dump site, found the suitcase, and then emptied it. So it was just pure chance that the Shaws showed up shortly thereafter and found the clothing, which led to them discovering Dexter's body. The biggest issue I have with this theory is that it's strange that a scavenger would go through Dexter's stuff and leave his money behind, but then again, if they came across his body, perhaps it scared them off from taking anything and potentially implicating themselves. If it was the killer who scattered the clothing, then I just can't think of any other reason why they would return to the dump site months after the crime unless they wanted Dexter's body to be found. It's also been up for debate whether the killer might have been a local or someone who was from out of state. On one hand, since the pickup truck had Arizona license plates, it's easy to assume he came from there. After all, if someone who normally lived in the warm climate of Arizona wound up getting stranded at a rest stop during a cold Montana winter, you could see how that might push them over the edge. But on the other hand, would an outsider have been able to find that remote dump site? I mean, it sounds like a location you would have to go out of your way to visit. It was on private property, and from what I can tell, only a handful of people were allowed to use the dump site. Not only was it 2 miles away from the highway on a dirt road, but you then had to travel 150 feet away from that road to find it. I suppose if the killer was driving around looking for a place to dump Dexter's body, he could have come across it by chance, but I don't know, if the killer was from out of state, then they certainly lucked out at finding the ideal dumping site, since the body was not found for months, and they would have been long gone by then. If the killer really did return to the dump months after the fact to scatter Dexter's clothing, then he has to be a local resident, as I have my doubts that someone who hailed from a faraway spot like Arizona would go back there. It sounds like the police were unable to ID the killer's pickup truck from the first 3 digits on the license plate, but even though it had Arizona plates, that doesn't necessarily mean he resided there at that time. I know that Clyde Mitchell mentioned that he saw bedding and clothes inside the truck to suggest someone was using it as a living space, so perhaps the driver was a transient with no fixed address who traveled throughout the U.S. and lived in his truck, in which case it would be very difficult to track him down. In spite of some reservations, I do have a feeling there is some truth to the police's theory that the perpetrator murdered Dexter because he ran out of gas and was angry that Dexter wouldn't help him. none of the other potential theories really make much sense. If this was a serial killer who was stalking random victims, it just seems strange that he would select an isolated rest stop in the middle of nowhere on a freezing November day, because for all he knew, it could have been several hours before someone showed up there. I guess another possible explanation is that this was a road rage incident in which Dexter and the killer had some sort of altercation on the highway which set him off, so when Dexter pulled over into the rest stop, he was murdered. But the fact that the perpetrator was seen carrying 2 containers of gasoline and went to the trouble of torching Dexter's car suggests to me that gasoline was the thing which set this crime in motion. In fact, I'm not even sure I agree with the theory that the killer murdered Dexter because he wouldn't provide him with assistance. I have a feeling this guy might have decided to kill Dexter no matter what he did. If Dexter hadn't pulled over into the rest area that morning, this guy may very well have murdered the next person who did. He just wanted to steal someone's car in order to acquire gasoline for himself, and since Dexter was a frail, elderly man, I'm sure he probably seemed like an ideal target. If Dexter was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and crossed paths with an unstable person, then this is an especially tragic story. We don't know the exact time Dexter was abducted from the rest area, but it seems like the next people who arrived after him were Fred Siegley, the custodian, and Clyde Mitchell, the maintenance supervisor, 2 men who would have been able to provide the perpetrator with assistance if he had run out of gas. So that makes the crime all the more senseless. You have to feel sorry for the entire Stefonek family, especially David, who had to experience the brutal murder of his father less than 1 year after his mother passed away. These types of unsolved crimes are particularly difficult when they take place under such puzzling circumstances and no one can understand why they happened. I do think the running out of gas theory is the strongest one, but I still can't help but feel there might be something missing here, as there are a few things about this crime which don't add up to me. After all this time, the murder will be very difficult to solve, and I'm not even sure the killer would still be alive today. But as we've seen in the past several weeks before this episode's release, a lot of famous cold cases have recently been solved, so you can never completely lose hope. So if you happen to have any information about the unsolved murder of Dexter Stefonek, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Anyway, before we wrap up, another reminder that The Trail Went Cold has just been launched on Patreon, so if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. In fact, just a few weeks ago, we released our very first exclusive bonus episode for our donors in tiers 2 and 3, and that episode chronicles the amazing life of the one and only Robert Stack. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide my thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. And incidentally, Vince's music tracks are now available for download as a bonus reward for all of our Tier 3 donors, so once again, feel free to visit our Patreon page for more information. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And we also have a Facebook discussion group if you would like to discuss these cases or true crime in general with myself and your fellow listeners, so feel free to join and I'll approve your entry into the group ASAP. So have yourself a good week and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.